In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, a groundbreaking book that introduced the world, for the first time, to the theory of evolution by natural selection. Or did it? Just a year prior, another naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace wrote a paper which also detailed a struggle for existence that caused species to change gradually over time. So, which of these 19th century scientists really discovered natural selection? And if it was Wallace, did Darwin steal it from him? Spoiler alert for this video, there is no straightforward answer to this question, and people disagree about the morality of some of Darwin's choices. So let's take a deep dive into the lives of Darwin and Wallace, their discoveries of natural selection, and the relationship they had with each other. Then I'll let you know what I think. Charles Darwin was born on February 12, 1809 in Shrewsbury, England. He grew up in a wealthy upper-class family and went to college with the initial intent to become a priest in the Anglican Church. In college, Darwin discovered he had an interest in science and natural history and decided to pivot. In 1831, at the age of just 22, he was given the opportunity to join the voyage of the HMS Beagle. The Beagle was intended as a surveying voyage, but Darwin joined as a naturalist, and used the trip as an opportunity to record natural and geologic observations as well as collect specimens. By the start of Darwin's journey, evolution, then called transmutation, was already a well-known theory, but Darwin himself was not a transmutationist. At that point, there was just no convincing mechanism that explained how evolution could occur. But on this voyage, with the help of a few finches, Darwin began to see that maybe transmutation was the answer to the question of species. By the end of the journey, after all he had seen, Darwin had become convinced of transmutation, and about a year later began developing his theoretical mechanism, natural selection. When Darwin started his journey, Alfred Russel Wallace was just 8 years old. He was born to a less wealthy family that, while not destitute, could not afford the luxuries of an expensive higher education like Darwin's. As a youngster, Wallace delighted in collecting beetles with his friend Henry Bates, and when he got a little older, read every scientific book and paper he could get his hands on. As a teen and young adult, Wallace entered the workforce and became a land surveyor. He continued to collect bugs and other specimens while on the job. When Wallace was 21, a popular but controversial book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, was published, which detailed the theory of evolution that preceded Darwin's in publication by many years. Vestiges and its author Robert Chambers were inspired by Charles Lyell's groundbreaking geological work, Principles of Geology, which argued that the Earth was very old and developed and changed over time by slow geologic changes. Chambers applied this idea to the development of species. Vestiges was quite popular but controversial at the time. It had no real mechanism that could explain how and why evolution would occur. Still, this book immediately caught Wallace's attention and likely sparked his interest in the origin of species. In 1848, Wallace and his bug-collecting buddy Bates decided to finance their own trip to South America, where they would make money doing what they already loved doing most, collecting bugs. The idea was they would collect rare specimens of beetles, butterflies, birds, and more, then send them back to their sponsor in England, who would sell them and also try to publish any scientific or natural history observations the Bug Boys would write. A year before the Bug Boys left, Wallace already had larger scientific goals in mind besides mere collecting. I should like to take some one family to study thoroughly, principally with a view to the theory of the origin of species. By that means I am strongly of the opinion that some definite results might be arrived at. By the start of Wallace and Bates's trip, Darwin had already been back from his voyage for over a decade, and had published his famous Voyage of the Beagle 4 years prior, which detailed his journey around South America and his circumnavigation of the globe. While this book did not detail Darwin's developing evolutionary mechanism, it did push him into the scientific mainstream, making Darwin a household name. Wallace and Bates had certainly read Darwin, and were even inspired by him for their own journey. But unlike Darwin, Wallace's and Bates's trip was not to sail around South America, but to explore within its depths. They landed in Belém in Brazil, then explored down the Amazon River, collecting all the while. They faced both triumph and troubles while exploring the Amazon, and eventually amicably split up and explored separately. Back in England, Darwin put years of research into developing his theory of natural selection. He studied biodiversity, geography, embryology, and especially the artificial selection of domesticated animals, all to give natural selection the strongest footing it could have when he eventually published something about it. He was keenly aware of how controversial it would be. In fact, he kept his theory secret from almost everyone. The only people he told were English botanist Joseph Hooker, American botanist Asa Gray, and eventually famed father of geology Charles Lyell, who was something of a mentor to Darwin. Lyell was profoundly influential in the scientific world at this time. His theories explaining gradual geologic changes and a very old history of the Earth were key to the development of transmutational theory, and to both Darwin and Wallace personally. Interestingly, Lyell actually did not believe that his gradual development of the Earth could be applied to the biological world. Indeed, he rejected transmutationism and believed instead in multiple separate acts of creation, a theory sometimes called special creationism, a common belief at the time. Both Lyell and Joseph Hooker will come back into our story later. After 4 years of collecting and studying in the Amazon rainforest, Wallace set off from Belém to return home to his family in England. He took the Helen, a British cargo ship, with quite the load in tow. Wallace was bringing back thousands of valuable specimens and his invaluable journals, scientific notes, and illustrations. These were meant to be the foundation of his next stage of scientific writing. But on August 6, 1852, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the Helen caught fire and sank. Thankfully, Wallace survived, but all of his collections and papers went down with the ship. It was an almost incalculable loss of knowledge and a huge personal hit to Wallace. Wallace and the crew survived for 10 days on lifeboats, before being picked up by the Jordison. Wallace eventually made his way back to England, but with a bruised spirit. A 4-year journey traversing the Amazon, and what did he have to show for it? Well, a few things actually. First of all, he was now far more experienced and knowledgeable about species distribution, environmental studies, and even anthropological studies. He had also made some money from the previous shipments of specimens he had sent back. Most importantly, his name was becoming more well known in scientific circles. Wallace, never one to dwell in despair for long, published several scientific papers upon his return, relying on his memory and letters he had previously sent back rather than his notes, which he lost the majority of. Then, just 2 years later, he left on another journey. This time, he was off to the Malay archipelago. In Malaysia, Wallace island hopped, collecting thousands of specimens which he sent back to England. In whatever spare time he could find, he wrote down his scientific ideas, including evolutionary ideas and pieces of evidence that would eventually lead to his discovery of natural selection. He also corresponded with friends, family, and naturalists back home, and even sent papers back to be published in England. One of them included his now famous Sarawak Law paper. Wallace's law stated that when new species come into existence, they are always very similar to another alike species. This law, if true, would create, in Wallace's words, a complicated branching of the lines of affinity, as intricate as the twigs of a gnarled oak or the vascular system of the human body. While Wallace did not say as much in the paper, this idea was certainly evolutionary. Unfortunately, the paper was not an immediate success. But several influential scientists of the age did take note of it. One was geologist Charles Lyell, who we've previously mentioned. Wallace actually wrote his paper specifically in response to Lyell's special creationist views. Lyell, of course, disagreed with the paper, but it caused enough doubt in him that he opened a new notebook dedicated to the species question. He also decided to have a visit with Darwin to discuss the paper, as he knew he was a transmutationist. At this meeting, Darwin revealed to Lyell his theory of natural selection. A year or so later, Darwin actually wrote to Wallace about the Sarawak Law paper, saying, "I can plainly see we have thought very much alike, and to a certain extent have come to similar conclusions. In regard to the paper in Annals, I agree to the truth of almost every word of your paper." Wallace was quite excited to find that the likes of Charles Darwin had read his paper, and didn't just read it, but agreed with him on almost every aspect. Darwin even hinted that he had been working for 20 years on a larger, greater work having to do with the same topic as Wallace's Sarawak Law. But he didn't tell Wallace what he intended as his greatest contribution to the field, natural selection. While Darwin was happy to find a new correspondent who agreed with his views on transmutation, he never could have guessed what would come from Wallace next. In 1858, while laying in bed suffering from a bad fever, ideas of transmutation and species population were bouncing around Wallace's head. Apparently, Wallace had a bit of an epiphany when he came up with natural selection. When considering Thomas Malthus's essay on population, Wallace had this realization. These checks, war, disease, famine, and the like, must, it occurred to me, act on animals as well as on man. Then I thought of the enormously rapid multiplication of animals, causing these checks to be much more effective in them than in the case of man. And while pondering vaguely on this fact, there suddenly flashed upon me the idea of the survival of the fittest, that the individuals removed by these checks must be on the whole inferior to those that survived. Wallace, still sick but excited by his new idea, wrote it all down in a paper titled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. I know, quite a mouthful. It is now most often called the Ternate paper, named after the Malaysian island Wallace was on when he wrote it. To say this paper was important is an understatement. It was the first paper ever shared to outline the theory of natural selection. But Wallace, perhaps not 100% confident in his idea, sought out some guidance and reassurance instead of sending it to who he normally would to get it published. After all, his last transmutationist paper, while admired by Darwin, was not quite the popular slam dunk in the natural history community as he hoped it would be. So, it is understandable that with his new paper, he wanted a scientist with similar views to read it before getting it published. So, naturally, Wallace sent his paper about natural selection to Darwin. Darwin read through Wallace's paper and was flabbergasted. He had kept natural selection a secret for over 20 years as he tinkered and toiled with what he wanted to become his grand treatise, his magnum opus. And here it was, spelled out before him in a paper by a lesser-known collector naturalist who had sent it to him personally. Darwin underwent a kaleidoscope of emotion. Just imagine for a second being in his shoes. What would you feel? Anger? Sadness? Resignation? Darwin felt it all. The truth is, however, that Darwin still had a lot of power in this situation. If he wanted to, he could have just wrote Wallace and told him the paper sucked. Or he could have wrote him explaining that he himself had come up with natural selection first and claimed his sole priority. Instead, dejected but wanting to do the right thing, Darwin sent his paper off to Lyell, which Wallace had requested if Darwin found the paper good enough. But before Lyell even received Darwin's foreword, Darwin sent another letter, begging him for advice. He was in despair. "I am very, very sorry to trouble you, busy as you are, in so merely personal an affair. I should be extremely glad now to publish a sketch of my general views on natural selection in about a dozen pages or so, but I cannot persuade myself that I can do so honorably. As I had not intended to publish any sketch, can I do so honorably because Wallace has sent me an outline of his doctrine? I would far rather burn my whole book than that he or any man should think that I had behaved in a paltry spirit. Do you not think his having sent me this sketch ties my hands? I could send Wallace a copy of my letter to Asia Gray to show him that I had not stolen his doctrine, but I cannot tell whether to publish now would be base and paltry." What was he to do? He wanted to establish his priority, but felt so guilty about potentially cheating Wallace out of his. He sent yet another letter to Lyell, this time saying that he decided that it would, indeed, be dishonorable for him to now publish something before Wallace. He also sent letters to Hooker for his advice, and Hooker met up with Lyell to discuss the situation. The two of them recognized the troublesome tangle that Darwin was in, and came up with an ingenious solution. A way to preserve the all-important priority of both Wallace and Darwin. They suggested to Darwin that they could announce the theory of natural selection for the first time to the scientific world as a sort of joint discovery. They could present Wallace's paper to the Linnean Society, and at the same session read a few of Darwin's personal writings on the subject as well, protecting Darwin's discovery while not disgracing Darwin by forgetting Wallace. And best of all, Lyell and Hooker offered to do this presentation themselves, giving their support to the situation and freeing Darwin from having to unseemingly defend himself as a co-discoverer. Darwin was incredibly thankful. "I had quite resigned myself and had written half a letter to Wallace to give up all priority to him, and should certainly not have changed had it not been for Lyell's and your quite extraordinary kindness. I assure you I feel it, and shall not forget it." The presentation at the Linnean Society went on without a hitch, and Darwin was very thankful to the both of them for their efforts. At the time, Darwin and Wallace would be considered co-discoverers of natural selection. But Darwin got right to work on his great book on the origin of species, which would be published the next year and would cement him, over Wallace, as the father of evolutionary theory. So, did Darwin steal natural selection from Wallace? In the literal sense, no. Darwin and Wallace both independently discovered natural selection on their own. But did Darwin steal the priority or the credit from Wallace? On the one hand, Darwin would not have published anything about natural selection in 1858 if Wallace didn't write his paper. And if Wallace would have sent it to anyone else other than Darwin and gotten it published, we would likely still think of Wallace today as the man who discovered natural selection. So, perhaps Darwin should have just published Wallace's paper and accepted the fact that he had been too slow. But on the other hand, Darwin really did come up with it 20 years earlier than Wallace, and Darwin could have just written to Wallace with proof that he had discovered it first fair and square, and therefore had the rights to publish something about it first. But Darwin didn't do that. Instead, he went for the middle ground that would preserve the priority of the both of them. But what did Wallace think about all of this? He sent off his paper to Darwin, hoping it would be good enough to forward to Lyell and perhaps get it published. But Wallace was a world away, so it took him a while to hear about all that had happened. But when he did, he seemed to have never felt even an ounce of disappointment or anger towards Darwin. In fact, Wallace was on cloud 9. He was thrilled that Darwin had found his paper so intriguing and interesting that it was read to the Linnean Society by Joseph Hooker and Charles Lyell of all people, and he immediately acquiesced to Darwin's priority. Allow me in the first place sincerely to thank yourself and Sir Charles Lyell for your kind offices on this occasion. I cannot but consider myself a favored party in this matter. I also look upon it as a most fortunate circumstance that I had a short time ago commenced a correspondence with Mr. Darwin, since it has led to the earlier publication of a portion of his researches and has secured to him a claim of priority. It would have caused me much pain and regret had Mr. Darwin's excess of generosity led him to publish my paper unaccompanied by his own much earlier, and I doubt not much more complete views on the same subject. And I must thank you for the course you have adopted, which while strictly just to both parties, is so favorable to myself. Wallace wrote something similar to Darwin as well, but that letter is unfortunately lost. Darwin wrote about their reply to Hooker, saying, "I admire extremely the spirit in which they are written. I never felt very sure what he would say. He must be an amiable man." In a letter back to Wallace, Darwin thanked Wallace for his disposition about the whole situation and promised to send him a copy of On the Origin of Species whenever he finished it. So, can we settle it here? If Wallace was happy about the situation, isn't that enough? Well, you could still argue that Wallace was taken advantage of. Darwin was much more well known and respected in the world of science at the time, so of course Wallace was happy to be associated with him. Maybe this is the story of the little guy being taken advantage of by the bigger guy without fully realizing it. But I don't really think that's true either. While still abroad, Wallace continued sending his papers to Darwin to get them published, indicating his trust in Darwin and the companionship they were developing. In his first paper that included discussions on natural selection, Wallace referred to it as Mr. Darwin's Principle. In future scientific works, and even personal correspondences, Wallace would continue crediting Darwin with the discovery of natural selection, even when advised not to by others. He also supported Darwin and natural selection against all kinds of detractors. Wallace became a great defender of Darwin, both of the man and his theory. As Wallace's life went on, he became incredibly influential in his own right, both in the realm of evolutionary studies and in other fields. There was never any indication that he was upset with Darwin or disappointed that he was overlooked as one of the co-discoverers of natural selection. And as the years went on, Wallace and Darwin corresponded more and more, both about new scientific ideas and eventually more personal news as well. In short, they became friends. Darwin would continue to ask Wallace's advice on his own works and trusted his opinions. When Wallace eventually fell out of favor in the scientific community due to his interest in and promotion of spiritualism, Darwin continued to support Wallace despite disagreeing with these tendencies. Darwin could recognize the brilliant scientific mind behind all of Wallace's oddities. At one point, Wallace fell into hard times financially, and Darwin managed to get a group of scientists together to convince the British government to award Wallace a pension for his scientific achievements, which Wallace was very grateful for. When Darwin eventually died in 1882, Wallace was a pallbearer in his funeral. I think it is safe to say that whether Darwin's handling of Wallace's Ternate papers was right or wrong, the two certainly had no harsh feelings towards each other on the matter. It is only a shame that today, Wallace is hardly remembered, mostly due to his own humility for not seeking the credit for one of the greatest discoveries in the history of science. 7 years after Darwin's death, Wallace did write his own book on natural selection, to act as a comprehensive overview and exposition of the theory. What did Wallace name his book? Darwinism. Thank you everybody for watching this video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments. The main source I used in the creation of this video was this amazing book, Radical by Nature, The Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace, by James Costa. There is so much more to Wallace than I've covered in this video, so please check out this book if you're interested. I also want to thank the Alfred Russel Wallace Correspondence Project, which provides all of Wallace's letters and journals in an online database. It was incredibly helpful for making this video. You might be wondering, at the end of all of this, about Charles Lyell, the father of geology and special creationist, who nevertheless was monumental in the development of evolutionary theory. Did he maintain his creationist stance? Well, due to overwhelming evidence, he eventually did come to accept evolution by natural selection as the way in which species are brought about. He maintained his Christian faith at the same time, by the way, because despite what many would have you believe today, faith and evolution are not at odds. But perhaps more on Charles Lyell and faith and science another time. See ya.